Daniel Sports Central will be giving you guys my Week 4 USFL power rankings, and 3 weeks of action are now in the books. And Week 3 in particular was a very unpredictable week. We saw some surprises go down in Week 3, so the rankings have certainly shifted going into Week 4. Let's go ahead and get into it with our number 8 team in this week's rankings. That's going to be the Pittsburgh Maulers. This team, it's pretty easy to put them at number 8 now that they lost to the Panthers 24-0. They lost to the Michigan Panthers, didn't even score a point against them, and they allowed 24 against the worst team offensively. I mean, the Panthers going into Week 3 only had scored 18 points in the prior 2 weeks. So I did have Michigan at number 8 last week, but it is clear and obvious that the Maulers are going to be number 8 this week. They're 0-3, the only winless team remaining in this league. They were 7 last week, and they just looked absolutely terrible on both sides of the ball in Week 3 of action. Josh Love was the primary passer for this team, 10 for 19, 83 yards. Overall, pretty terrible stats. London rushing, 18 attempts for 68 yards, and then Trey Walker was the top in receiving, 5 receptions for 58 yards. So nothing much went right for Pittsburgh in Week 3. So we'll see how they do coming up next week, or this upcoming week against the Generals, which New Jersey is a pretty decent football team in this league. So that should be a challenging matchup, but we'll see if the Maulers can bounce back. Number 7 is going to be the Michigan Panthers, and honestly, the Panthers Maulers are easily the 2 worst teams in the league if you ask me right now. The Panthers looked better for sure in Week 3. They lost the Generals 6-10 in Week 2 and only scored 12 in Week 1. So, they had only scored 18 points combined going into Week 3, and they scored 24 against the Maulers and shut them out 24-0. So it wasn't a bad game. Shea Patterson was terrible as he has been so far this season, 8 for 17, 49 yards. Those were his stats in Week 3. So, you can see the quarterback situation for a few of these teams is poor, to say the least. But Reggie Corbin had an outstanding game for the Panthers against the Maulers. He single-handedly led this offense to a good game, I would say. 20 attempts, 133 yards, 1 touchdown. This team really, they went hard on the rushing game in Week 3, and it overall succeeded for them. They had a couple of running backs who got some good yards, but the passing game obviously was a mess again, as Patterson only had 49 yards on 17 passes. And, of course, he got the top in receiving. Lennar Jr., 4 receptions, 41 yards. So, it wasn't a terrible game for him, but once again, the passing game was pretty irrelevant for the Panthers in Week 3. It was the rushing game and being on the ground, which is what gave them, I would say, that offensive. Offensively, they were decent because they relied on the rushing game. So look for that in Week 4 as this team faces off against Philadelphia. But yeah, this team is number 7 going into Week 4. Number 6 is going to be the Philadelphia Stars. Speaking of which, this team lost to the Generals 16-24 in their Week 3 matchup. They were 1-2. They were number 4 last week, dropping down 2 positions to number 6. And this team, Brian Scott, is injured. Their quarterback, that's going to have a huge impact on this team, and we kind of saw that when he got injured. This team just did not look. Brian Scott, I said this going into Week 3, he's one of the big 3 of the quarterbacks in this league. There are 3 quarterbacks that are standout, and Brian Scott is definitely one of those 3, and unfortunately he got injured. So Case Cookus was the top in passing for this team last week, 13 for 20, 146 yards, 1 touchdown. He didn't have a terrible game, but Brian Scott, he really showed some potential. So I feel for him because he was building a pretty strong. In Week 3. He had an outstanding game against the Maulers. So we'll see how this Stars team fares out without him, but that certainly is going to be a tough loss there. So we'll see how that turns out. And once again, I feel for Brian Scott because the goal of a lot of these players is to get into the NFL, and Brian Scott was starting to build a resume. His stats were looking pretty good, and unfortunately he gets injured. But otherwise, in the rushing, Paul Terry, 8 attempts for 33 yards. And Maurice Alexander was the top in receiving, 8 receptions, 87 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had a pretty good game for this team in Week 3, but in the end, it didn't turn out as this team would have hoped, as they took a loss 16-24. This upcoming week, they got Michigan. So the Michigan Panthers, that should be an interesting matchup there coming up here this weekend. Number 5 is going to be the Houston Gamblers. This team lost to the Bandits 26-27. Close matchup, one of the better matchups, or even the best one of Week 3. We saw both teams play it up really closely, and the Gamblers are now 1-2, but they haven't looked. I'm going to say, they haven't looked terrible. They're 1-2. They've lost their last 2 games, but in close matchups, and they haven't looked terrible. So the Gamblers, I do want to give some credit to. I mean, they're 1-2, but I do think this team is capable of getting some wins in this season. That's for sure. Clayton Thorson, 15 for 24, 240 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. Mark Thompson was the top in rushing, 24 attempts, 147 yards, and 1 touchdown. And then Ratliff was the top in receiving, 2 receptions, 85 yards, 1 touchdown. So overall, I mean, offensively, this team was not bad. Clayton Thorson didn't look terrible, even though he threw an interception. And I feel like the Gamblers, they could have easily beaten Tampa Bay there. So this is not a bad football team, and I feel like they could easily be higher than 5, but since they're 1-2, I'm going to keep them here for now. Number 4 is going to be the New Jersey Generals. This team's moving up 2 positions after last week's win over Philadelphia, and they certainly are, I would say, a team that's got a high ceiling. I mean, their rushing game has been pretty good. DeAndre Johnson was the top in passing, 6 for 8, 130 yards. So this team in the quarterback situation isn't the strongest, but they certainly, I feel like, show some good potential. Turpin was the top in receiving, 5 receptions, 78 yards, and this team is 2-1 heading into week 4 when they face off against the Maulers, which Pittsburgh is a lost cause if you ask me right now. It'll be interesting to see how they do, if they can even get a win at this point. I mean, they looked flat, to say the least, in week 3. So we'll see. But yeah, Generals, I think this team definitely, they show some potential, and I like where this team is heading for sure. So New Jersey's number 4 this week. Number 3 is going to be the Tampa Bay Bandits. This team stays at number 3 after last week's win over the Gamblers. 27-26 was your final score. And this team, they looked better in week 3. They obviously looked horrible in week 2 against the Breakers, losing that game 3-34. And that's when I dropped this team down to number 3 from number 1. I mean, this team was the preseason favorite to win the league, and rightfully so. Jordan Ta'amu, likely considered the best quarterback in the league for sure heading in. And I mean, he looked terrible in week 2. He was okay. He was better in week 3. I mean, he still wasn't. I mean, he wasn't totally clean, but he looked better. So that's a good sign. Juwan Washington was the top in rushing, 15 attempts, 65 yards, 1 touchdown. And Derek Dillon was the top in receiving, 6 receptions, 124 yards, and 1 touchdown. So this team has got a tough one coming up in week 4 against the Stallions. Should be an interesting matchup. You got 2 undefeated teams, or actually you got the Stallions, who are the last undefeated team now that New Orleans has taken a loss. So Stallions are the only undefeated team remaining. That'll be a challenge for sure, and we'll see where Tampa Bay is at when they play them in this upcoming week in week 4. Number 2 is going to be the New Orleans Breakers. This team was the clear and obvious number 1 after they beat the Bandits in week 2, but in week 3 they lost to the Stallions. 13-22 was the final score. Kind of a tough loss. I mean, this team, they didn't look terrible. It wasn't a terrible game, but they certainly didn't look quite as good in week 3 than they did in week 2. Kyle Sloter, their quarterback, of course, 26 for 47. He passed 47 times in week 3, 240 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. I mean, of course, he got that interception, and of course, his accuracy wasn't very good, it seems, in the week 3 matchup. But in week 2, that was the best performance we've seen to date out of a quarterback in this league. So I like New Orleans. I feel like this team is definitely one of the better teams in the league, but we'll see how they do coming up against the Gamblers, a pretty decent team in week 4. Jordan Ellis was the top in rushing, 25 attempts, 90 yards, and then Johnny Dixon was the top in receiving, 7 receptions, 86 yards, 2 touchdowns. And for number 1, no surprise here, it's going to be the Birmingham Stallions. This team, the last undefeated team in the league, 3-0. They beat the Breakers in week 3, huge win, 22-13, and they beat the Gamblers, of course, also a decent team, in week 2, 33-28. And they got a challenge coming up against the Bandits in week 4. This team, Jamar Smith, he definitely, he threw 2 touchdowns and 197 yards in week 3, but he was 15 for 38 and also threw a pick, so it wasn't totally clean, but he was the top in rushing as well in this team in their week 3 matchup, 8 attempts on 59 yards. And the top in receiving was Victor Bolden Jr., 6 receptions, 70 yards, and 1 touchdown in week 3. So Birmingham certainly, this team, they're looking excellent going into week 4. The clear and obvious, I would say, number 1 team in this league right now. And we'll see how they do in week 4, whether or not they can stay undefeated. But that's going to wrap it up for today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on these rankings, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.